Welcome back to Weathering the Storm, a podcast where we strive to weather the storms of life by placing and sustaining an unwavering faith in God. I'm your host, Drew Suttles, and I welcome you back to Season 9 of Weathering the Storm. We are engaging in a study this season on the major prophets and how we can study their lives, study the books that bear their names, and be able to apply these things to our lives. Hopefully that will help us navigate through some difficult times. Thus far, we have introduced the major prophets, which of course are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. We did that in our first episode. In episode 2, we did a specific episode looking at the book and the man, Isaiah. And then last week we studied about Jeremiah, and we also mixed in the book of Lamentations. This week, in this episode, we're going to discuss the book of Ezekiel. And I want to give you an introduction, an overview to the book. Also have a quote from Frank Chesser, who wrote a book about Ezekiel entitled The Man of Kibar. And if you don't have that, I encourage you to have it. He's just a prolific writer, and really enjoyed going through that book. It's designed as a study book with questions in the back. So if you're looking for a study book for Ezekiel, I recommend that, as well as his book on Isaiah, entitled The Heart of Isaiah. And so I want to share some thoughts with that as well. And remember, this season, as we're going through the major prophets, after we introduce these next two, today in this episode with Ezekiel, next week introducing Daniel, we will then start to dive into specific passages, and we'll spend 4 episodes on each major prophet. So in other words, we'll begin with a series on Isaiah. We're going to look at some specific passages over 4 episodes where we can discuss the storms that he faced, what he wrote about, what the people were going through, and then make application to our lives. We'll do that with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and that will be the remainder of the season. It's a little bit of a different format, but I'm hoping that by going through this, that it'll be beneficial, and that we will increase our knowledge of the major prophets together, and that also we'll be able to make the application to our lives to the glory of God. Before we dive into an introduction of the book of Ezekiel, I want to remind you that Weathering the Storm is a podcast on the Scattered Abroad Network. This is a network of podcasts where we're striving to reach as many souls as possible with the gospel through the avenue of a podcast. And we have material and content coming out every day of the week. This podcast, of course, airs on Thursdays. But we encourage you to check out the entire lineup. If you haven't already, please go and subscribe to the master feed of the Scattered Abroad Network. That way you've got one click and you've got everything there that comes with a podcast platform. We're thankful for the work that we're able to do with the network, and we're grateful that the Memphis School of Preaching is, of course, the backbone of this, because all of us as hosts are graduates of MSOP, and Scattered Abroad is now a work of the School of Preaching there. And so just grateful to be on this network, grateful for all of you listening and your support, and most of all, and most importantly, we appreciate the prayers that you offer up on our behalf as we do this work for God. But again, I thank you for listening to Weathering the Storm, and I do hope that this episode, that this season, that this podcast as a whole will help you draw closer to God, will help you to increase and to fortify your faith, that you may be able to weather the storms that you face in your life. So with that being said, let's dive into the book of Ezekiel. I was very fortunate to study the book of Ezekiel and the book of Daniel at the feet of Bobby Liddell. Brother Liddell is a great gospel preacher, and was a wonderful teacher. He had a very seriousness about him, a very serious way of teaching. I remember the first day of class, he said, "This class will go a lot smoother if you let me teach and save your questions for the end." And it was kind of his way of saying, I'm going to lecture. I'm going to share with you what I've studied in my notes. I want you to jot these down. And then later, if I haven't covered something you have a question about, then you can ask. And I appreciated that, because as a student, I knew I could go in. I knew what to expect. I knew that he was going to always be prepared. I knew that he studied this material ahead of time. He had studied it for years. And that was a boost of confidence for me to know that that this man has studied this material, and now he's teaching it after he's taught it in Bible classes, after he's preached it, after he's gone on different campaigns and mission trips to teach this material. And so being able to type it, being able to go back and of course, validate what was said with the Word of God, it was a blessing. And I'm thankful that I can continue to study this book and have these notes to share with you because he did such a great job introducing the book that I have a lot of my notes from class that I have transferred over to my Bible software program. And so I want to use that introduction and some of the material that I've added over the last few years in hopes of introducing the book of Ezekiel and the man Ezekiel as we think about the major prophets this season. When we think about the book of Ezekiel, we start with the time of writing, and it involves the Babylonian captivity. We've talked about this at length. This is a main theme when it comes to the prophets, and that is the southern kingdom of Judah going into Babylonian captivity. If you remember, there were 3 waves of captivity, 606, 597, and then 586 BC. And these 3 waves of captivity proved to be extremely important in Bible history. We know why it happened, because of idolatry, because of failure to keep the sabbatical year, basically because of God's people not doing what he said to do. They turned their allegiance and their attention to other gods, to false gods, such as Baal, Ashtaroth, Molech, Chemosh, Dagon, all these idol gods of these foreign countries, and that was a slap in the face to God, who of course said, "You shall have no other gods before me," and they did. They went against God's will, and because of that, they were punished. There were deportations under Nebuchadnezzar, who, of course, sieged Jerusalem as he led the Babylonian army there. 606, 597, and 586 we mentioned. And the captivity revolves around the last 5 kings of Judah. Those were Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiachin, Zedekiah. And so when you think about these kings, why is that so important? Well, it gives us a time frame. We can go back in history and know when they were reigning as kings. And so we mentioned Jehoiakim or Jehoiakim, also known as Eliakim, who reigned from 608 to 597 BC. And then we mentioned Jehoiachin or Jehoiakim, known also as Coniah or Jeconiah. That, of course, is important because Jesus was in the lineage of Jeconiah according to Matthew chapter 1. And so he reigned in 597 BC and was carried into Babylonian captivity. The reason that's important with Ezekiel is because Ezekiel prophesied during the reign of Jehoiakim or Coniah or Jeconiah. Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 2 gives us that information. Ezekiel was taken captive when he was 25 years old, and he began to prophesy at the age of 30. And so he would have been carried into captivity at the same time as Jehoiakim. When you think about this period, the 3 prophets, you had Ezekiel, who was the prophet of the countryside around the river Kibar. You had Daniel, who was the prophet in the court among the first carried captive to Babylon. And then you have Jeremiah, who was the prophet at home. And we talked about some of that last week when we introduced the book of Jeremiah. The man, Ezekiel, his name means God is strong or God strengthens. And of course, this is prophetic of Ezekiel's mission, to go and to be strong and to deliver this message to a people who were hard-headed and hard-hearted, the book of Ezekiel says. But his home was in Jerusalem, but he was carried to Babylon, again, 597 BC. The Bible teaches he was a priest, the son of Buzi, and he was probably about 25, and so 30 years old, he began to prophesy. And if you remember, that was the age when that would begin. You think about Joseph, think about Jesus, who would have been about 30, beginning his work, his ministry. Ezekiel had a deep sympathy for his people, but he could also be very blunt. And one of my preacher friends, Gene Hill, always says, don't use so much tact that you don't make contact. In other words, you've got to tell people like it is, but of course do so in a loving way. But his style was dramatic, Ezekiel's was, with vivid imagery and vivid illustrations. But he was wholly and completely in subjection to God's will. He knew what he needed to do. He saw his task clearly, and he gave himself wholeheartedly to it. Much like Isaiah, much like Jeremiah, much like Daniel. This is a theme that is consistent throughout the major prophets. And so 592 BC would be the year, if we were to date the writing of the book, when he began to prophesy at the age of 30. And he continued to prophesy for 20 plus years. Ezekiel 29:17 says, "It came to pass in the 27th year, in the first month, and the first day of the month, that the word of the Lord came to me." And then in Ezekiel 40 and verse 1, it says the 25th year of our captivity at the beginning of the year. So he gives you time frames throughout the book that teaches us that he prophesied for several decades. So keep in mind the background of the book of Ezekiel, again, was the Babylonian captivity, and the book involves around the second departure, which would have been 597 BC. Ezekiel's task was to work to keep the captives faithful to God, even though they were in an idolatrous land. That was his job. Now, you talk about a very difficult role, but Ezekiel did it to the way that God would have him to do it. Therefore, he was successful. And so, again, he had to keep the captives faithful, try to keep them focused, try to keep them true to God, even though they found themselves in a idolatrous land. And think about the application today. You know, we live in an ungodly society. We live in a world of darkness, if you will. But our job, our role is to be the salt, be the light, to preserve, to heal, to do those things that salt does, but also to reflect the light and love of Jesus to the world. And that is how we can, of course, carry out our mission. When we think about the peculiarities of the book, what are some unique qualities of Ezekiel? Well, one of the things is that a lot of it's apocalyptic language, much like you'll find in the book of Revelation. The use of visions, symbolic actions, allegories, parables. And so this was Ezekiel's way, and really God through Ezekiel, to send these messages to the people. Some of his visions seem to extend to the book of Revelation, as I mentioned. You have the cherubim, Ezekiel 1, Revelation 4, Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38, Revelation 20, a phrase to eating the book or eating the scroll, Ezekiel 3, Revelation 10, New Jerusalem, Ezekiel 40 through 48, and of course Revelation 21, and then the river, the water of life, Ezekiel 47, Revelation 22. There is an emphasis on the individual. That is a huge part of the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 3, talking about the watchman, which we'll dive into that in a few weeks as we get into the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel 18, it is not the Father does not bear the iniquity of the Son, nor the Son bear the iniquity of the Father. Again, pointing to individual accountability for your actions. The individual attained a place not before realized in the teaching of the prophets, which is interesting when it comes to Ezekiel, because of the use of expressions which suggest fundamental ideas of the prophets. The glory of Jehovah, indicating his glorious majesty and power. The name of Jehovah, indicating his nature and characteristics. And so by certain acts, God would sanctify himself, show himself holy, and demonstrate the moral aspects of his divine nature. And over 50 times in the book of Ezekiel, reference is made to the word of the Lord. And we mentioned this last week in studying Jeremiah. All these references, hundreds and hundreds of references to the word of the Lord came to me saying, so that the purpose is for Isaiah, for Jeremiah, for Ezekiel, for Daniel, they understood that they were prophets. They were mouthpieces of God. They were inspired of God. It wasn't their message. They had no authority, no right to add or take away. They were to open up their mouths and speak what God would have them to speak. And we brought this point out. Gospel preachers today must do the same thing. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God, 1 Peter 4:11. Speak like the prophet spoke. We have an inspired message as well, and it's written down for us in the Word of God. The theme of the book of Ezekiel is centered around two phrases. First is, they shall know that I am the Lord. That's found 63 times. And then Son of Man is found 93 times. Very interesting that Ezekiel would be called Son of Man as often as he was. And of course, you go to the New Testament and you think about Jesus. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, or the Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost. And so it's an interesting phrase to use, but that's how God referred to Ezekiel. Again, 93 times in the book. When it comes to the book itself, in the first 24 chapters, there is doom. Jerusalem will fall. The people will be taken to Babylon as captives. Ezekiel would be there. He would see it. He would, again, prophesy to the people who are in captivity, trying to hopefully point them to a positive direction. But then chapters 25 through 48, there's a message of hope. The nation will be raised. The nation will be restored to their land, and ultimately be made one under David, when the enemies will be destroyed and Jerusalem will be built upon the ruins of the old. And so Brother Liddell closes with an analysis of Ezekiel. I want to go through this very quickly and then get to Brother Chester's quote, and that will be our time for today. He said there are two divisions of the book. Chapters 1 through 24, as we mentioned a moment ago, visional scenes and predictions before Jerusalem's fall. And then chapters 25 through 46, symbolic prophecies after the destruction of the city and the temple. There are 9 subdivisions throughout the book. You have the prophet's call, the visions of the cherubim and the inscribed roll that he was to eat, Ezekiel 3. There is the devastation of the land of Judah that is foretold, forecasted, if you will, the temple's destruction by Nebuchadnezzar, the judgment of the sword and the dispersion, the fulfillment of the time for return. There are several visions of the pollution of the temple, a series of reproofs and warnings, exposing of the false prophets in Jerusalem and in Babylon. There's a rebuke of the elders who visited Ezekiel for their hypocrisy. You have the predictions delivered on the day the siege began. You read about the commandment not to weep as a sign that the fall of Jerusalem will be such a terrible calamity. There'd be no opportunity for mourning, which is an amazing thing. Judgments against the heathen nations, specifically the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, Tyre and Sidon and Egypt. All these foreign nations, the judgment is delivered upon them. Again, that's chapters 25 through 32. But then in chapters 33 through 37, there's an announcement of predictions against Jerusalem. There's a description of the true shepherd, and there are contrasts with the false shepherds of Judah, and a threefold prophetic application. The land would be delivered from the Edomites. Israel will be reinstated and purified. That's the vision of the dry bones, which we're definitely going to get into later this season. And then victory would be complete. Finally, in chapters 40 through 48, there's a symbolic representation of the new dispensation from the high mountain after the destruction of the old temple, showing the beauty and the grandeur of the new city and the new temple to be fulfilled in the establishment of the church. The material temple of the Jews in Jerusalem and its worldly sanctuary could not be more than a faint future of better things to come. So again, I want to give credit to Brother Bobby Liddell for the great study that he put into Ezekiel. And this was all just introductory material. This was all just introduction from our study together. And so I was very thankful to have that material and to be able to share that with you. As we close out this episode, I mentioned a moment ago that I wanted to do some reading with you from Frank Chester's book. And he does such a great job introducing Ezekiel that I wanted to spend a few moments just sharing his thoughts on Ezekiel, the prophet, the man, the book, and close out our episode with this. He said of Ezekiel, he lived in his own house by the Kibar River in Babylon with his wife, the delight of his heart and the desire of his eyes. It had been 5 years since Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon knocked on the gates of Jerusalem and conveyed Jehoiakim, Ezekiel, and 10,000 others into Babylonian captivity. Moses opened and closed his final sermon to the second generation from Egypt with a forward look to Israel's potential for apostasy and loss of the land of promise. Decades of prophetic thunderings had reverberated throughout the nation, warning of this tragic day. Most likely it was the 30th year of his own life that Ezekiel, by the river of Kibar, looked upward and saw visions of God, and what he saw left him prostrate upon his face. When Ezekiel beheld God in all of his transcendent majesty and holiness, he saw the object of his mission in the manacles of captivity, yet rebellious, impudent, and hard-hearted, led by elders like unto themselves with idols in their heart. 7 years of preaching and signs prior to Jerusalem's destruction were futile in effecting penitence in the hearts of the masses, and except for a preserving mark upon the foreheads of a spiritual remnant, the dead carcasses of the children of Israel before their idols constituted a striking contrast to Ezekiel in venerate prostration before God. Having witnessed the glory of the Lord, Ezekiel commenced his journey through the mind of God, wherein he was informed of lamentations and mourning and woe, which were to befall Judah. Manifold visions of human evil, so egregious as to surpass the power of human expression to adequately describe, witnessed the flight of divine pity, and judgment so severe and extensive, that Ezekiel falls upon his face and exclaims, Ah, Lord God, wilt thou destroy all the residue of Israel in thy pouring out of thy fury upon Jerusalem? The verbal expressions in the bulk of the book of Ezekiel that inspiration utilizes to delineate the depravity and vileness of Israel and the pagan nations are so candid and poignant as to render the biblically uneducated and non-spiritual mind incapable of mental and emotional acceptance and appropriation. The divine portraits that God repeatedly paints of his wrath, fiery fury, and merciless judgment are so repugnant to the mind of liberalism that it cries, "This is not the God of love and grace of the gospel." This study is a spiritual voyage with God and Ezekiel through the preponderance of the book of Ezekiel that depicts God's mighty wrath against horrendous evil to its exquisite portrayal of Israel's restoration to life, God, Canaan, and one another. It points to God's sovereignty, his judgment upon the enemies of his people, and his special regard for the righteous remnant, to the reality of his spiritual kingdom, the church, emanating from Christ and Calvary, the consummating work of redemption commencing in Genesis 3:15 and 12:3. It is a divine narrative of the nature of God, sin, judgment, and redemption that will have a profound and immeasurable impact upon the heart and mind and mightily enrich the soul. Wonderful thoughts there from Frank Chesser in his introduction to the book of Ezekiel. And I hope and pray that the thoughts that we've shared in this episode will help encourage you to dive in and study the book of Ezekiel for yourself. And hopefully as we dive into some specific passages later this season, you can refer back to this introduction and that it will be helpful in your own study and in your walk with the Lord. Once again, I want to thank you for listening today. I hope that this episode will be helpful. I'm looking forward to next week as we introduce the book of Daniel. Thank you once again, and may God bless you.